On March 11, 2011, Japan's nuclear safety regime operated exactly as its architects intended. Emergency protocols activated automatically. Regulatory agencies issued statements following established procedures. Industry operators implemented crisis management frameworks developed through decades of institutional refinement. Every participant performed their assigned role within a governance structure that had been carefully designed to manage nuclear operations in a seismically active democracy. The reactors at Fukushima Daiichi suffered core damage not because safety systems failed to function, but because the institutional architecture surrounding those systems had been optimized for different objectives. For 40 years, a regulatory framework had evolved to balance industrial promotion with public reassurance, information control with stakeholder confidence, and technical compliance with political sustainability. Each component operated as designed. The Ministry of Economy promoted nuclear development, the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency validated industry assessments, and Tokyo Electric Power Company managed operational risks within approved parameters. Yet this carefully constructed regime, when tested by a crisis that demanded rapid information sharing and transparent decision-making, systematically amplified rather than contained the consequences of the initial emergency. The failure was not a deviation from institutional design. It was the inevitable result of a system structured to prioritize coordination over independence, consensus over challenge, and procedural compliance over adaptive response. How can a governance system perform all its functions correctly while ensuring that safety becomes impossible to achieve? The Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency represented the institutional embodiment of Japan's approach to nuclear regulation. Established within the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, NISA functioned as both safety regulator and industry promoter, a dual mandate that encoded fundamental contradictions into every aspect of nuclear oversight. This organizational structure was not an accident or oversight but a deliberate design choice that reflected Japan's broader approach to industrial development during the post-war economic expansion. NISA's regulatory framework operated on the principle that industry self-assessment, validated by government review, could ensure adequate safety margins while maintaining operational efficiency. The agency's technical staff routinely reviewed safety analyses submitted by plant operators, evaluating compliance with established criteria and approving operational modifications based on these submissions. This process appeared rigorous and technically sound, generating extensive documentation that demonstrated regulatory engagement with safety concerns. However, the regulatory architecture contained a structural flaw that became apparent only during crisis conditions. NISA's primary institutional relationship was with METI, whose mission centered on promoting Japanese industrial competitiveness and energy security. Nuclear power represented a cornerstone of this energy strategy, providing domestic electricity generation that reduced dependence on imported fossil fuels. Within this context, NISA's role was implicitly understood as ensuring that nuclear operations could continue safely, rather than independently determining whether they should continue at all. This distinction proved critical during the development of safety standards and emergency response protocols. When TEPCO submitted tsunami hazard assessments that justified existing seawall heights based on historical data, NISA's review process focused on the adequacy of the analytical methodology rather than the comprehensiveness of the underlying geological evidence. The agency verified that TEPCO had followed established procedures for hazard assessment, but did not independently evaluate whether those procedures captured the full range of possible tsunami scenarios. The regulatory approval process reflected this institutional bias toward validation rather than challenge. NISA's technical staff possessed genuine expertise in nuclear engineering and safety analysis, but their institutional mandate required them to work within existing frameworks rather than question fundamental assumptions. When presented with safety justifications that met established criteria, the regulatory response was approval and documentation rather than skeptical analysis or demand for additional evidence. Personnel exchange patterns between NISA and the nuclear industry reinforced this dynamic. Senior regulators routinely transitioned to industry positions after completing their government service, while industry engineers often joined NISA to contribute their technical experience to regulatory oversight. This rotation was defended as ensuring that regulators maintained current technical knowledge and that industry benefited from regulatory insight, but it also created personal and professional relationships that discouraged adversarial oversight. The information architecture supporting NISA's regulatory decisions further amplified these institutional biases. Safety assessments flowed from plant operators to regulatory staff through formal submission processes that emphasized documentation, completeness, and procedural compliance. Alternative analyses or dissenting technical opinions had no formal pathway into the regulatory review process unless they originated from the regulated entities themselves. This created a closed information loop where regulatory decisions were based primarily on industry-generated data and industry-preferred analytical frameworks. Emergency response planning reflected these same institutional constraints. NISA's emergency procedures assumed that plant operators would provide accurate and timely information about developing situations, enabling regulatory authorities to coordinate appropriate response measures. The protocols emphasized maintaining communication with other government agencies and ensuring that emergency actions aligned with broader policy objectives, but they did not address scenarios where operator information might be incomplete, delayed, or systematically biased. Training and professional development within NISA reinforced procedural compliance over independent technical judgment. Regulatory staff learned to evaluate submissions against established criteria and to document their analyses according to prescribed formats. Success was measured by the thoroughness of regulatory reviews and the absence of procedural violations rather than by the quality of independent technical assessment or the identification of unrecognized safety concerns. The agency's relationship with international nuclear safety organizations provided an additional layer of validation for this approach. NISA participated in International Atomic Energy Agency review processes and benchmarked its regulatory practices against other national agencies, consistently receiving acceptable ratings that confirm the adequacy of its institutional framework. These international validations serve to reinforce internal confidence that Japanese nuclear regulation met global standards for technical competence and procedural rigor. Budget allocation and resource management within NISA reflected the agency's subordinate position within the broader METI organizational structure. Regulatory staff levels and technical capabilities were determined by ministry-wide priorities that emphasized energy policy implementation over independent safety oversight. During periods of budget constraint, regulatory functions were expected to maintain operational efficiency while working within reduced resource allocations, creating additional pressure to streamline review processes and minimize analytical challenges to industry submissions. The cumulative effect of these institutional arrangements was a regulatory system that functioned effectively within its design parameters, while systematically undermining the independence and skepticism essential for effective safety oversight. NISA's staff performed their assigned duties competently, generating extensive documentation of regulatory engagement with safety issues. Plant operators received timely approvals for operational modifications and emergency response plans. Government officials could point to robust regulatory oversight as evidence of adequate safety protection. Yet this apparent regulatory success masked fundamental weaknesses that became apparent only when the system faced conditions beyond its design assumptions. The institutional architecture had optimized for consensus and continuity, rather than challenge and adaptation. When crisis conditions demanded rapid independent assessment and transparent information sharing, the regulatory system defaulted to established patterns of coordination and validation that proved inadequate for the unprecedented circumstances facing Fukushima Daiichi. The regulatory framework's design assumptions about information flow, institutional relationships, and emergency response capabilities shaped every aspect of the crisis response. Operators who had been trained to provide information through established channels continued to do so even when those channels proved inadequate for real-time decision-making. Regulatory staff who had learned to evaluate information within existing analytical frameworks struggled to assess conditions that fell outside their procedural guidelines. Government officials who expected coordinated institutional responses found themselves managing a crisis that exceeded all established coordination mechanisms. This institutional failure occurred not because individual participants lacked competence or commitment, but because the system's design priorities had embedded contradictions that became critical vulnerabilities under extreme conditions. The Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency functioned exactly as its institutional architecture required, but that architecture had been optimized for industrial promotion and regulatory validation rather than independent safety oversight and crisis adaptation. When these design assumptions proved inadequate, the resulting failure cascaded through every aspect of the nuclear safety regime, amplifying rather than containing the consequences of the initial emergency. The institutional vulnerabilities embedded within Japan's nuclear regulatory framework created fertile conditions for operational practices that prioritized continuity over transparency. Tokyo Electric Power Company had evolved sophisticated mechanisms for managing information flow and maintaining regulatory relationships that served the company's institutional interests while appearing to fulfill safety obligations. These practices, refined over decades of operation, established patterns of normalized deviance that shaped organizational responses to unexpected conditions. TEPCO's operational culture reflected the broader institutional environment within which the company functioned. As a regulated monopoly responsible for providing reliable electricity to the Tokyo metropolitan region, the company faced intense pressure to maintain continuous operations while demonstrating compliance with safety requirements. This dual mandate created organizational incentives that consistently favored problem resolution over problem disclosure, leading to systematic patterns of information management that minimized regulatory scrutiny. The company's approach to safety reporting exemplified these institutional dynamics. TEPCO maintained extensive internal documentation of equipment problems, maintenance issues, and operational anomalies, demonstrating technical competence in identifying and tracking safety-relevant conditions. However, the company's reporting to regulatory authorities emphasized resolved problems rather than ongoing concerns, creating an information filter that presented a sanitized version of plant operational reality to external oversight bodies. This filtering process was not typically deliberate deception, but rather the logical outcome of institutional incentives that rewarded successful problem resolution while penalizing the disclosure of unresolved issues. Plant managers who reported equipment problems to corporate headquarters were expected to include proposed solutions and implementation timelines. Corporate staff who compiled regulatory submissions focused on demonstrating effective problem management rather than highlighting areas of continuing concern. The cumulative effect was a reporting system that systematically underrepresented the complexity and uncertainty inherent in nuclear plant operations. Regulatory submissions documented successful completion of maintenance activities but provided limited insight into the decision-making processes that determined maintenance priorities. Safety analyses included conservative assumptions and generous safety margins, but did not address the institutional factors that might influence the application of these margins during actual operations. TEPCO's maintenance practices reflected these same institutional pressures. The company maintained sophisticated technical capabilities for equipment inspection, analysis, and repair, employing experienced engineers and following detailed procedures for safety-related maintenance activities. Plant staff demonstrated genuine commitment to operational safety and technical excellence, working within established frameworks to identify and address equipment problems. However, maintenance scheduling and resource allocation decisions were influenced by operational priorities that emphasized electricity generation reliability alongside safety considerations. During periods of high electricity demand or limited generating capacity, maintenance activities faced pressure to minimize duration and avoid unnecessary plant shutdowns. These operational constraints created subtle but persistent incentives to optimize maintenance strategies for schedule completion, rather than comprehensive problem resolution. The company's emergency response training programs demonstrated similar patterns. TEPCO invested significantly in emergency preparedness, conducting regular drills and maintaining detailed emergency procedures that covered a wide range of potential plant conditions. Plant operators received extensive training in emergency response techniques and demonstrated competence in implementing established protocols during simulated emergency conditions. Yet this emergency preparedness focused primarily on scenarios that fell within established design parameters, and could be managed through existing procedures. Training exercises emphasized rapid implementation of predetermined responses rather than independent assessment of unprecedented conditions. When operators encountered situations that did not match existing emergency categories, their institutional training encouraged them to apply the closest available procedural response rather than to develop novel approaches based on first principles analysis. Communication protocols within TEPCO reinforced these operational patterns. The company maintained sophisticated information systems that enabled rapid communication between plant sites, corporate headquarters, and regulatory authorities during normal and emergency conditions. These systems functioned effectively for transmitting predetermined categories of information through established channels, ensuring that authorized personnel received timely updates about plant status and operational activities. However, the communication protocols assumed that significant events could be categorized according to existing frameworks, and that appropriate response measures could be determined through established decision-making processes. When plant conditions evolved beyond existing categories or required decisions that fell outside established authorities, the communication systems created delays and coordination problems that impeded effective response. Personnel management practices within TEPCO contributed to these institutional dynamics through promotion and assignment policies that rewarded operational success and regulatory compliance. Engineers and managers who maintained smooth plant operations while avoiding regulatory problems advanced within the corporate hierarchy, while those who encountered significant difficulties or regulatory scrutiny faced career limitations regardless of their technical competence or safety commitment. These incentive structures created subtle but persistent pressures for problem minimization and conflict avoidance. Plant staff learned to frame problems in terms that emphasized manageability and progress toward resolution rather than highlighting areas of genuine uncertainty or concern. Managers developed skills in presenting complex technical issues to corporate leadership in ways that demonstrated competent problem management, while minimizing implications for broader operational or regulatory concerns. The company's relationship with equipment vendors and technical consultants reflected these same institutional constraints. TEPCO maintained relationships with leading nuclear technology companies and regularly engaged external experts to support plant operations and safety analyses. These technical relationships provided access to advanced analytical capabilities and specialized expertise that enhanced the company's technical competence. Yet vendor relationships were managed within commercial frameworks that emphasized solution delivery and project completion rather than open-ended technical exploration. When TEPCO engaged consultants to analyze specific problems or evaluate safety questions, the commercial arrangements typically specified deliverables and timelines that assumed problems could be resolved within existing technical frameworks, rather than requiring fundamental reassessment of design assumptions or operational practices. Quality assurance programs within TEPCO demonstrated sophisticated understanding of nuclear safety requirements and regulatory expectations. The company maintained extensive procedures for document control, configuration management, and technical review that met or exceeded industry standards for nuclear quality assurance. Plant activities were subject to multiple levels of review and approval, ensuring that safety-significant decisions received appropriate technical evaluation. However, quality assurance processes focused primarily on compliance with established procedures rather than independent evaluation of procedural adequacy. Review activities verified that prescribed steps had been followed and that required documentation had been completed, but they did not typically challenge the underlying assumptions or analytical frameworks that supported existing procedures. Training programs for quality assurance personnel emphasized procedural knowledge and regulatory compliance rather than independent technical judgment or critical thinking skills. Quality assurance staff learned to identify deviations from established requirements and to ensure corrective actions addressed procedural violations, but they were not encouraged to question whether existing requirements adequately addressed evolving plant conditions or emerging technical understanding. The cumulative effect of these organizational practices was a company that demonstrated technical competence and regulatory compliance while systematically limiting its capacity for independent assessment and adaptive response. TEPCO's staff possessed genuine expertise in nuclear technology and safety analysis, but their institutional environment channeled this expertise toward validation of existing approaches rather than critical evaluation of fundamental assumptions. When plant conditions evolved beyond existing analytical frameworks or required decisions that challenged established procedures, the company's institutional reflexes defaulted toward problem minimization and procedural compliance, rather than independent analysis and transparent communication. These reflexes had been refined through decades of successful operation within a regulatory environment that rewarded consistency and continuity over challenge and adaptation. The institutional dynamics that shaped TEPCO's operational culture were not unique to the company, but reflected broader patterns within Japan's nuclear industry and regulatory environment. Other nuclear operators demonstrated similar organizational characteristics, and regulatory authorities reinforced these patterns through oversight approaches that emphasized procedural compliance over independent technical assessment. The massive earthquake that struck Japan at 1446 on March 11, 2011, initiated a sequence of events that would expose fundamental vulnerabilities in the design assumptions underlying Fukushima Daiichi's safety systems. The seismic event itself fell within the operational envelope that plant systems had been designed to accommodate, triggering automatic shutdown sequences and emergency response protocols that functioned as intended. However, the tsunami that followed approximately 50 minutes later created conditions that exceeded the foundational assumptions upon which the plant's emergency preparedness had been constructed. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant had been designed with tsunami protection based on historical analysis of seismic events and their associated wave heights along Japan's Pacific coast. Engineering assessments conducted during the plant's initial design phase and subsequent safety reviews had established a design-basis tsunami height of approximately 5.7 meters above mean sea level, with the plant's critical safety systems positioned above this level to ensure protection from anticipated flooding scenarios. These design calculations reflected the analytical methodologies and geological understanding available at the time of the plant's construction and subsequent modifications. Engineers had examined historical records of tsunami events, applied conservative analytical margins, and designed protective barriers that exceeded the maximum wave heights documented in available historical data. The resulting seawall height of approximately 10 meters above sea level appeared to provide substantial protection against anticipated tsunami scenarios. However, geological evidence that became available in the years preceding the March 2011 earthquake suggested that significantly larger tsunami events had occurred in the region's geological past. Research conducted by Japan's Earthquake Research Headquarters and other institutions had identified geological deposits indicating tsunami inundation extending much further inland than would be possible with wave heights matching the plant's design basis assumptions. This emerging geological evidence created a fundamental challenge to the assumptions underlying Fukushima Daiichi's tsunami protection strategy. If the geological indicators accurately reflected historical tsunami events, then wave heights substantially exceeding the plant's design basis were not only possible, but had occurred within the geological time frame relevant to nuclear facility design. This possibility had implications not only for the adequacy of the existing seawall, but for the entire emergency power infrastructure that had been positioned based on the original tsunami protection assumptions. TEPCO's response to this emerging geological evidence reflected the institutional dynamics and decision-making frameworks that characterized Japan's nuclear industry. The company commissioned additional analysis to evaluate the implications of the new geological data, engaging technical consultants to assess potential tsunami scenarios and their impact on plant safety systems. These studies confirmed that tsunami heights significantly exceeding the plant's design basis were theoretically possible under extreme seismic conditions. However, the company's ultimate response to these analytical findings prioritized operational continuity over design basis modification. Rather than undertaking extensive plant modifications to address potential tsunami scenarios that exceeded existing design assumptions, TEPCO elected to maintain existing protective measures while continuing to monitor ongoing geological research. This decision reflected institutional incentives that favored demonstrated compliance with existing regulatory requirements over proactive response to emerging technical understanding. When the March 11 earthquake occurred, generating ground motions that exceeded design basis accelerations at multiple reactor units. The plant's seismic protection systems responded as intended. Automatic reactor shutdown systems activated immediately upon detection of seismic motion exceeding predetermined thresholds, inserting control rods into reactor cores and initiating emergency cooling procedures. These safety systems functioned correctly, demonstrating the effectiveness of seismic protection measures that had been incorporated into the plant's original design and subsequent modifications. The loss of external electrical power following the earthquake also proceeded according to established emergency response protocols. Emergency diesel generators activated automatically to provide electrical power for safety-critical systems, ensuring continued operation of reactor cooling pumps and instrumentation systems. Plant operators implementing emergency procedures found their systems responding as training exercises had prepared them to expect, with backup power systems maintaining the electrical supplies necessary for safe reactor shutdown and cooling. However, the arrival of the tsunami approximately 50 minutes after the initial seismic event created conditions that fell outside the plant's design basis and emergency preparedness assumptions. Satellite imagery and ground-level observations documented wave heights reaching 13 to 15 meters above sea level in the immediate vicinity of the plant, substantially exceeding both the design basis tsunami height and the protective capacity of the existing seawall. The tsunami's impact on plant infrastructure was immediate and comprehensive. Seawater inundation reached elevations well above the design basis flood level, overwhelming protective barriers and flooding critical equipment areas that had been positioned based on the original tsunami protection assumptions. The emergency diesel generators that had been providing backup electrical power were located in areas that the design basis analysis had determined would remain dry during credible tsunami scenarios. Flooding of the emergency diesel generator buildings eliminated the backup power sources upon which the plant's emergency response procedures depended. Without electrical power, the reactor cooling systems that had been functioning effectively since the earthquake lost their driving force, creating the potential for reactor overheating as decay heat continued to be generated within the reactor cores despite their shutdown condition. Plant operators found themselves managing a station blackout scenario that exceeded the duration and scope addressed in their emergency response training. Emergency procedures had contemplated temporary loss of electrical power with restoration expected within hours through either external grid reconnection or emergency generator repair. The comprehensive nature of the tsunami damage made both external power restoration and emergency generator repair impossible within the timeframes assumed by existing procedures. The loss of electrical power also eliminated most instrumentation systems that operators relied upon to monitor reactor conditions and cooling system performance. Without electrical power for instrumentation, operators could not determine whether reactor cooling was adequate or whether alternative cooling methods were successfully maintaining safe reactor conditions. This instrumentation blackout created a fundamental information gap that existing emergency procedures had not anticipated. Communication systems that connected the plant with TEPCO headquarters and regulatory authorities also suffered damage from the tsunami, limiting the ability of off-site personnel to understand plant conditions or coordinate appropriate emergency response measures. Plant operators were forced to make critical decisions about reactor cooling and safety system operation based on limited information and without the external technical support that emergency procedures assumed would be available. The magnitude of infrastructure damage extended beyond the immediate plant site to include the electrical transmission systems, roads, and communication networks that connected Fukushima Daiichi with external emergency response resources. This broader infrastructure damage meant that emergency equipment and personnel that might have been mobilized to support plant recovery efforts could not reach the site within the timeframes contemplated by existing emergency procedures. Initial damage assessments conducted by plant personnel revealed the extent to which tsunami conditions had exceeded design basis assumptions. The flooding had reached elevations and penetrated areas that the original hazard analysis had determined were not credibly threatened by tsunami events. Emergency equipment that had been positioned based on these hazard assessments was either damaged by flooding or inaccessible due to debris and continued seawater presence in critical plant areas. The transition from routine emergency response to unprecedented crisis management began immediately following the tsunami impact, as operators recognized that existing procedures did not address the combination of extended station blackout, comprehensive instrumentation loss, and extensive infrastructure damage that characterized their actual situation. Decision-making shifted from procedural implementation to improvised problem-solving as operators attempted to develop alternative approaches to reactor cooling and plant stabilization. This transition exposed the limitations of training and preparedness programs that had emphasized rapid implementation of predetermined responses rather than independent analysis of novel conditions. Operators possessed extensive knowledge of plant systems and emergency procedures, but their preparation for crisis conditions had assumed that credible emergencies would fall within the scope of existing analytical frameworks and procedural guidance. The institutional response to these unprecedented conditions reflected the same organizational dynamics that had shaped TEPCO's approach to tsunami hazard assessment and emergency preparedness. Initial communications with corporate headquarters and regulatory authorities emphasized efforts to restore normal emergency response capabilities rather than acknowledging the fundamental inadequacy of existing emergency frameworks for the actual conditions facing the plant. This communication pattern created additional delays in recognizing the need for emergency response measures that fell outside established protocols and procedures. Off-site personnel, who might have provided alternative analytical perspectives or emergency resources, continued to expect resolution through conventional emergency response measures, rather than understanding the extent to which plant conditions had exceeded all design basis assumptions. The loss of electrical power and instrumentation at Fukushima Daiichi created conditions where the physical processes occurring within reactor systems diverged fundamentally from operator understanding and control capabilities. Without the monitoring systems that had been designed to provide real-time information about reactor conditions, operators were forced to make critical decisions based on incomplete data about core cooling effectiveness and containment integrity. The physics of reactor thermal hydraulics continued to evolve according to natural laws that did not accommodate the limitations of human knowledge or the constraints of damaged emergency systems. Reactor cooling under normal shutdown conditions depends on continuous circulation of coolant through the reactor core to remove decay heat generated by radioactive fission products. Even after control rod insertion terminates the nuclear chain reaction, decay heat continues at levels that require active cooling for extended periods. The emergency cooling systems at Fukushima Daiichi had been designed to provide this cooling function using electrically powered pumps that circulated coolant through heat exchangers, transferring thermal energy to external heat sinks. The station blackout eliminated the electrical power required to operate these cooling pumps, but reactor cooling continued initially through natural circulation processes driven by density differences in the cooling water. As water near the reactor core heated due to decay heat absorption, it became less dense and rose toward the top of the reactor vessel, while cooler water descended to replace it. This natural circulation process could provide adequate cooling as long as sufficient water inventory remained in the reactor cooling system. However, the effectiveness of natural circulation cooling depended on maintaining water levels that ensured continuous contact between coolant and reactor fuel assemblies. As cooling water heated and converted to steam, water inventory in the reactor vessel gradually decreased unless makeup water could be supplied to replace the converted coolant. Without electrical power to operate makeup water systems, operators faced a progressive loss of reactor coolant inventory that would eventually compromise cooling effectiveness. Plant operators attempted to monitor reactor conditions using battery-powered instrumentation systems that remained functional after the loss of main electrical power. These instruments provided limited information about reactor water levels and pressure conditions, but their accuracy and reliability under the extreme conditions created by the tsunami damage remained uncertain. Operators were forced to infer the effectiveness of reactor cooling from indirect indicators that might not accurately represent actual core conditions. The reactor pressure vessel instrumentation that remained functional indicated water levels that appeared adequate for reactor cooling. But these instruments measured conditions in the reactor vessel plenum rather than directly monitoring water contact with reactor fuel assemblies. Under normal operating conditions, plenum water levels provided reliable indication of core cooling adequacy because coolant circulation patterns ensured consistent water distribution throughout the reactor vessel. However, the loss of forced circulation created the potential for non-uniform water distribution within the reactor vessel, where plenum water levels might not accurately represent cooling conditions at the reactor core. Steam generation and natural circulation patterns under station blackout conditions differed substantially from the flow patterns that had been used to calibrate instrument readings during normal operations. Reactor pressure conditions provided additional information about cooling system performance, but pressure readings also required careful interpretation under the unprecedented conditions facing plant operators. High reactor pressure could indicate either effective steam generation from adequate core cooling or steam generation from inadequate cooling that had progressed to the point where coolant was boiling directly on fuel assembly surfaces. Operators attempted to maintain reactor cooling by implementing manual procedures for steam relief and water injection that had been developed for station blackout scenarios of limited duration. These procedures involved opening safety relief valves to reduce reactor pressure and enable injection of makeup water using manually operated or diesel-driven pumps. However, the comprehensive nature of infrastructure damage limited the availability of makeup water sources and injection equipment. Steam relief operations successfully reduced reactor pressure in some units, but the released steam carried radioactive contamination from the reactor coolant system into the containment atmosphere. This radioactive release was anticipated by emergency procedures and fell within design parameters for containment systems, but it increased radiation levels in areas where operators needed to work to implement manual cooling procedures. Containment pressure monitoring indicated that steam relief operations were successfully transferring thermal energy from the reactor vessel to the containment atmosphere. But containment pressure continued to rise as steam condensed and accumulated within the containment structure. Without electrical power to operate containment cooling systems, operators faced eventual containment overpressure conditions that could compromise containment integrity. Efforts to inject makeup water into reactor vessels faced multiple technical obstacles that reflected the unprecedented nature of plant conditions. Available water injection systems required either electrical power that was no longer available or access to plant areas that remained flooded or blocked by debris from the tsunami. Mobile water injection equipment had to be transported to the plant site over damaged roads and connected to reactor systems through improvised piping arrangements. The fire protection system represented one potential pathway for water injection that did not require normal electrical power, utilizing diesel-driven pumps that could operate independently of the main plant electrical systems. However, connecting fire protection systems to reactor cooling systems required manual valve operations in areas with elevated radiation levels and physical access limitations caused by debris and flooding. Reactor vessel pressure had to be reduced sufficiently to enable effective water injection through the fire protection system, requiring coordination between steam relief operations and water injection activities. This coordination proved challenging without normal communication systems and with limited instrumentation to verify the effectiveness of pressure reduction efforts. As hours passed without effective cooling restoration, reactor core conditions began to evolve beyond the parameters addressed in existing emergency procedures. Core temperatures increased as decay heat accumulation exceeded the cooling capacity provided by remaining water inventory and natural circulation processes. Elevated temperatures initiated chemical reactions between fuel assembly cladding materials and steam that generated hydrogen gas while consuming coolant water. The zirconium steam reaction that produced hydrogen also released additional thermal energy, accelerating the core heating process and increasing the rate of coolant consumption. This reaction represented a positive feedback mechanism where inadequate cooling led to processes that further reduced cooling effectiveness, creating the potential for rapidly accelerating core damage if cooling could not be restored. hydrogen generation within the reactor vessel created additional challenges for containment pressure management and personnel safety. Hydrogen gas, mixed with air or steam in the containment atmosphere, posed explosion hazards that emergency procedures had not fully anticipated. Containment venting operations intended to reduce pressure could potentially release hydrogen to reactor building atmospheres where ignition sources might cause explosions. Radiation monitoring systems that remained functional indicated increasing radiation levels in areas surrounding reactor systems, suggesting that fuel assembly integrity was being compromised as core temperatures exceeded design limits. These radiation increases confirmed that reactor cooling had become inadequate to prevent fuel damage, but they provided limited information about the extent of core damage or the effectiveness of ongoing cooling efforts. Plant operators found themselves managing conditions that progressed beyond the scope of existing emergency procedures while facing information limitations that prevented accurate assessment of core cooling effectiveness. Decision-making under these conditions required engineering judgment about reactor thermal hydraulics and materials behavior that extended beyond the procedural guidance available for station blackout scenarios. Communication with off-site technical support remained limited due to infrastructure damage, preventing plant operators from accessing external expertise that might have provided alternative analytical perspectives or technical recommendations for unprecedented conditions. Operators were forced to rely on their understanding of reactor systems and emergency procedures while recognizing that existing procedures did not address the combination of extended station blackout, comprehensive instrumentation loss, and potential core damage that characterized their situation. The transition from emergency response procedures to crisis management reflected fundamental limitations in the analytical frameworks that had been used to develop emergency preparedness requirements. Existing procedures assumed that credible emergency conditions would fall within established analytical boundaries and could be managed using predetermined response measures supported by available instrumentation and communication systems. When actual plant conditions exceeded these analytical boundaries, operators discovered that their preparation for emergency response had emphasized rapid implementation of established procedures rather than independent engineering analysis of novel conditions. The institutional training and organizational culture that had proven effective for managing conventional emergency scenarios became constraints rather than resources when conditions evolved beyond established frameworks. The attempts to stabilize reactor conditions at Fukushima Daiichi created a complex web of interdependent challenges that tested the limits of both technical systems and human decision-making capabilities. As plant operators worked to restore cooling and containment integrity, their interventions generated secondary effects that often complicated rather than resolved the underlying crisis. The physics of damaged reactor systems did not accommodate the sequential, procedural approach that emergency training had emphasized, instead requiring simultaneous management of multiple evolving hazards under severe resource constraints. Containment venting operations represented one of the most critical stabilization measures available to plant operators, offering the potential to reduce containment pressure while managing the radioactive releases that accompanied steam relief from overheated reactor cores. The containment venting systems had been designed to provide controlled release pathways that would prevent containment failure while minimizing off-site radiological consequences. However, implementing these venting operations under actual emergency conditions proved far more complex than design analyses had anticipated. The venting process required manual operation of isolation valves that had been designed for remote operation from the main control room. Without electrical power to operate these valves remotely, plant personnel had to access valve locations within the reactor building to perform manual operations in areas with elevated radiation levels and physical obstacles created by earthquake and tsunami damage. These access requirements exposed workers to radiation doses that exceeded normal operational limits while placing them in potentially hazardous environments. Successful containment venting depended on coordination between valve operations that had to be performed in sequence to establish effective flow pathways from the containment atmosphere to the plant's exhaust systems. This coordination proved challenging without normal communication systems and with limited ability to verify valve positions or flow rates through the venting system. Operators were forced to infer the effectiveness of venting operations from indirect indicators such as containment pressure readings and radiation monitoring data. The venting operations successfully reduced containment pressure in some reactor units, preventing immediate containment failure and creating the potential for continued cooling operations. However, the released radioactive materials created new challenges for ongoing emergency response activities. Radiation levels in areas surrounding the reactor buildings increased substantially, limiting access for equipment repair and manual operations needed to restore cooling systems. More significantly, the hydrogen gas generated by fuel-cladding reactions was released along with steam and other radioactive gases during containment venting operations. This hydrogen accumulated in the secondary containment buildings where it mixed with air to form potentially explosive mixtures. The reactor building ventilation systems, which had lost electrical power along with other plant systems, could not adequately remove hydrogen accumulations or prevent the formation of explosive concentrations. Hydrogen explosions occurred in Units 1, 3, and 4. Causing substantial structural damage to reactor building upper levels and severely complicating ongoing stabilization efforts. These explosions were not anticipated by existing emergency procedures, which had focused on preventing hydrogen accumulation within primary containment, rather than managing hydrogen releases into secondary containment spaces. The explosive force damaged equipment and infrastructure needed for cooling system restoration while creating additional debris that blocked access to critical plant areas. The explosions also forced evacuation of plant personnel at critical moments when manual operations were needed to maintain reactor cooling and containment integrity. Emergency response procedures had not adequately addressed the competing safety requirements of protecting workers from explosion hazards while maintaining the continuous presence needed for manual equipment operation under station blackout conditions. Water injection efforts faced similar complications as operators attempted to establish reliable cooling using improvised equipment and water sources. The fire protection system provided one pathway for water injection, but its effectiveness depended on reducing reactor pressure sufficiently to overcome the pump discharge pressure limitations. This pressure reduction required steam relief operations that contributed to containment pressurization and hydrogen generation, while reducing the coolant inventory that water injection was intended to restore. Available water sources for injection operations included both fresh water from plant storage tanks and seawater from the nearby ocean. Freshwater injection was preferred to minimize corrosion and contamination of reactor systems, but available freshwater supplies were limited and could not support extended injection operations. The transition to seawater injection represented a fundamental change in plant chemistry that would cause extensive corrosion damage to reactor systems, while providing the large water inventory needed for continued cooling. Seawater injection created additional operational challenges related to pump performance, piping integrity, and long-term cooling effectiveness. The high salt content of seawater accelerated corrosion processes within reactor systems while potentially affecting heat transfer characteristics needed for effective core cooling. However, seawater represented the only water source available in quantities adequate for extended injection operations under the conditions facing plant operators. Establishing reliable flow paths for water injection required improvised piping connections between injection pumps and reactor systems using equipment and materials available on site. These connections had to be assembled under emergency conditions without normal construction quality controls or pressure testing procedures. The reliability and flow capacity of improvised injection systems remained uncertain throughout the stabilization efforts. Electrical power restoration represented another critical element of stabilization efforts, offering the potential to restore normal cooling systems, instrumentation, and communication capabilities. Mobile generators and emergency power supplies were transported to the plant site to provide electrical power for critical systems. But connecting these power sources to plant electrical systems required extensive cable routing through areas damaged by tsunami and complicated by ongoing emergency operations. The prioritization of electrical loads during power restoration efforts reflected the competing demands of reactor cooling, containment integrity, and personnel safety systems. Limited electrical capacity had to be allocated among reactor cooling pumps, instrumentation systems, lighting for emergency operations, and communication equipment needed for coordination with off-site support. These allocation decisions were made under time pressure without complete information about system power requirements or the availability of additional electrical resources. Radiation monitoring and personnel protection created additional constraints on stabilization activities as radiation levels increased throughout the plant site due to containment venting, hydrogen explosions, and potential fuel damage. Workers conducting manual operations were required to limit their exposure time and wear protective equipment that reduced their mobility and communication capabilities. These radiation protection requirements extended the time needed for critical operations while limiting the number of personnel who could safely work in high radiation areas. The coordination of multiple simultaneous stabilization activities proved extremely challenging without normal communication systems and with limited visibility into the effectiveness of ongoing operations. Operators had to balance competing priorities such as containment pressure reduction, water injection, electrical power restoration, and personnel safety without clear information about which activities were most critical for preventing further core damage or radioactive releases. Decision-making under these conditions required continuous reassessment of priorities and resource allocation as new information became available about reactor conditions and the effectiveness of ongoing stabilization efforts. However, the information available to decision-makers remained limited and often conflicting, requiring engineering judgment about complex technical interactions under conditions that had never been analyzed or simulated. The institutional response to these stabilization challenges reflected the same organizational dynamics that had shaped emergency preparedness and training programs. Initial coordination efforts emphasized restoring normal emergency response capabilities rather than adapting to the unprecedented nature of actual plant conditions. Communication with regulatory authorities and government officials focused on demonstrating progress toward conventional emergency resolution rather than acknowledging the fundamental inadequacy of existing emergency frameworks. This communication pattern created additional complications for resource allocation and technical support as off-site authorities continued to expect resolution through conventional emergency response measures. The transition from emergency response to crisis management required recognition that existing institutional frameworks and technical procedures were inadequate for actual plant conditions, but this recognition challenged fundamental assumptions about emergency, preparedness, and regulatory oversight. 3:21 p.m. The physical evidence that emerged in the months and years following the Fukushima Daiichi accident provided definitive answers to questions that had remained uncertain during the crisis itself. Direct inspection of reactor cores and containment structures revealed the actual extent of damage and the effectiveness of emergency measures, confirming some operational assumptions while contradicting others. This forensic evidence demonstrated conclusively that the institutional safety regime had failed not because of inadequate technology, but because of systematic barriers to accurate information flow and independent assessment that prevented effective response to unprecedented conditions. Post-accident inspections of reactor pressure vessels and containment structures required the development of specialized robotic equipment capable of operating in high radiation environments for extended periods. These inspection tools provided visual documentation of core damage patterns, structural integrity conditions, and the distribution of melted fuel materials within reactor systems. The inspection data revealed core damage that exceeded all estimates made during the emergency response period, confirming that reactor cooling had been inadequate despite operator efforts to maintain water injection. Unit 1 inspection results showed that fuel melting had been extensive, with substantial portions of the reactor core having relocated to the lower head of the reactor pressure vessel and potentially penetrated into the primary containment structure. The extent of fuel relocation indicated that core temperatures had exceeded the melting point of uranium dioxide fuel pellets for extended periods, creating conditions far more severe than operators had recognized during the crisis. The inspection evidence demonstrated that water injection efforts, while preventing even more severe consequences, had not been sufficient to prevent substantial core damage during the critical hours following the loss of electrical power. Core cooling had been compromised despite operator efforts to maintain water inventory through improvised injection systems, confirming that the manual cooling methods available under station blackout conditions were inadequate for the thermal loads generated by decay heat and fuel cladding reactions. Containment inspection data revealed that primary containment integrity had been maintained in most areas despite the severe core damage conditions, demonstrating the effectiveness of containment design in limiting radioactive releases even under beyond design basis conditions. However, the inspections also identified areas where containment penetrations and seals had been compromised, creating release pathways that had contributed to off-site contamination during the accident. The hydrogen explosions that had occurred in reactor buildings were confirmed to have resulted from hydrogen accumulation in secondary containment areas rather than primary containment failure. This confirmation validated operator concerns about hydrogen management while demonstrating that existing emergency procedures had not adequately addressed the potential for hydrogen release into reactor building atmospheres during extended venting operations. Radiation measurement data collected during and after the accident provided comprehensive documentation of the timing, magnitude, and distribution of radioactive releases from the damaged reactors. This data confirmed that the majority of radioactive material releases had occurred during containment venting operations and hydrogen explosions rather than as a result of primary containment failure, supporting the conclusion that containment systems had functioned effectively even under extreme conditions. Environmental monitoring data demonstrated that radioactive contamination patterns were significantly influenced by meteorological conditions during the release period, with wind direction and precipitation patterns determining the geographic distribution of contamination. Areas northwest of the plant received substantially higher contamination levels than areas to the south and west, creating evacuation and recovery challenges that had not been anticipated by existing emergency planning. The comparison between predicted and actual contamination patterns revealed limitations in atmospheric dispersion models that had been used for emergency planning purposes. Existing models had not adequately accounted for the complex terrain and meteorological conditions that influenced actual contamination distribution, leading to evacuation decisions that in some cases moved residents into more contaminated rather than less contaminated areas. Analysis of operator actions during the crisis confirmed that personnel had performed competently within the constraints imposed by damaged systems and limited information, but also revealed systematic biases in decision-making that reflected institutional training and organizational culture. Operators had consistently favored actions that appeared to maintain existing systems rather than implementing alternative approaches that might have been more effective under actual plant conditions. Communication analysis demonstrated that information flow between the plant, corporate headquarters, and regulatory authorities had been severely constrained by both technical limitations and institutional protocols that were inadequate for managing unprecedented conditions. Critical decisions had been delayed while information moved through established channels that assumed normal communication capabilities and conventional emergency scenarios. The institutional response to the crisis had emphasized restoring normal operational and regulatory relationships rather than adapting to the unprecedented nature of actual conditions. This institutional conservatism had created additional delays in recognizing the need for emergency measures that fell outside established frameworks while limiting access to alternative technical perspectives that might have informed more effective response strategies. Regulatory analysis conducted after the accident identified systematic weaknesses in the institutional framework that had governed nuclear safety oversight. The Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency's position within the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry had created inherent conflicts between safety oversight and industrial promotion that had compromised independent technical assessment. Personnel exchange between regulatory and industry organizations had further undermined the independence and skepticism essential for effective safety regulation. International review teams confirmed that these institutional weaknesses were not unique to Japan but reflected broader patterns of regulatory capture and organizational complacency that could be found in nuclear industries worldwide. The accident had exposed vulnerabilities in institutional arrangements that had been masked by decades of successful operation under normal conditions, but became critical weaknesses when systems faced unprecedented challenges. Emergency preparedness analysis revealed that existing procedures and training programs had been optimized for scenarios that fell within established analytical frameworks, rather than developing adaptive capabilities needed for conditions that exceeded design assumptions. Emergency response had emphasized rapid implementation of predetermined procedures rather than independent engineering analysis of novel conditions, creating institutional reflexes that proved counterproductive when actual conditions differed from procedural assumptions. The technical lessons emerging from Fukushima Daiichi extended beyond specific equipment modifications to encompass fundamental questions about safety culture, institutional design, and the relationship between technical competence and organizational effectiveness. The accident had demonstrated that sophisticated technical systems could not compensate for institutional arrangements that systematically limited information flow, discouraged independent assessment, and prioritized operational continuity over adaptive response. Regulatory reform efforts, initiated in response to the accident, focused on establishing independent nuclear safety oversight, separate from industrial promotion functions, implementing more rigorous emergency preparedness requirements, and developing institutional capabilities for managing beyond design basis events. These reforms represented recognition that effective nuclear safety required institutional arrangements that supported, rather than constrained, the technical competence and independent judgment essential for managing complex technological systems. The international implications of the Fukushima accident extended beyond technical safety improvements to include fundamental questions about the institutional arrangements needed to govern complex technological systems in democratic societies. The accident had demonstrated that technical competence alone was insufficient to ensure safety when institutional frameworks systematically limited the application of that competence to unprecedented conditions. The long-term recovery challenges facing the Fukushima region provided additional evidence of the institutional failures that had contributed to the accident's consequences. Decontamination efforts faced technical and organizational obstacles that reflected the same institutional dynamics that had constrained emergency response, while evacuation and resettlement decisions continued to be influenced by institutional priorities that emphasized demonstrable progress over transparent acknowledgement of ongoing uncertainties. The cumulative evidence emerging from post-accident analysis confirmed that the failure at Fukushima Daiichi had occurred outside the core in the institutional arrangements that surrounded and governed nuclear operations, rather than in the technical systems that had been designed to ensure reactor safety. The reactor systems had performed within their design parameters under conditions that exceeded design assumptions, but the institutional systems that were supposed to adapt to unprecedented conditions had failed comprehensively. This institutional failure represented not a deviation from established patterns, but the inevitable consequence of organizational arrangements that had been optimized for consensus and continuity rather than independent assessment and adaptive response. When faced with conditions that demanded rapid information sharing, transparent decision-making, and innovative technical approaches, the institutional system defaulted to established patterns of coordination and validation that proved inadequate for unprecedented circumstances. The forensic evidence demonstrated conclusively that effective nuclear safety required institutional arrangements that supported, rather than constrained, the technical competence and independent judgment essential for managing complex technological systems under uncertain conditions. The accident had exposed fundamental limitations in institutional designs that had been successful under normal conditions, but became critical vulnerabilities when systems faced unprecedented challenges that demanded adaptive, rather than procedural responses.